Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and once again it's time for the Q&As, so let's go ahead and get this started. Alright, first question. Hi Coach, I know you're a fan of high carbs, but is there a limit when someone is pushing 4,000 calories if fats and protein are kept at a minimum of 50 grams of fat, 160 grams of protein, and the rest carbs? Even if all the carbs are from whole foods, is there any cause for concern? No, there really shouldn't be. As far as calories go, when we talk about the least taxing stress on the body, carbs, and when I say carbs, I'm talking about most whole foods. I'm not talking about eating 2,000 calories of table sugar or 2,000 calories of high fructose corn syrup here. But all these concerns about carbs and insulin sensitivity is nonsense. It's not based on science. It's not based on research. That's not how the human body works, particularly in active people. What usually causes a decrease in insulin sensitivity for people who aren't putting any drugs in their body that decrease this, who lift weights vigorously, who do cardio, who are conditioned, people who work out, people who take working out seriously. And I'm going to assume if you're going to do a 4,000 calorie clean bulk like that, you're probably pretty serious about your fitness at that point. The only time we start seeing insulin sensitivity decrease is from body fat gain. In other words, when you bulk on surplus calories for long enough that you see a very significant increase in body fat, that is when you suffer the negatives. And your body doesn't care at that point where those extra surplus calories came from. Now, what we do know is that highly refined sugars and saturated fats both contribute more to insulin sensitivity when you are gaining body fat at a significant rate. So that's cause for concern in that regard. But if you're on a lower fat diet, you're going to accrue less body fat when you're bulking. And the only counter argument to this is that some people, when they are forced to eat whole food carbs and a fairly low fat diet, simply cannot eat a caloric surplus. And that's the reality. And that's one reason that sort of diet works well for weight loss, and it has in many clinical trials and cure diabetes and everything else, is because it's very difficult to overeat starchy carbs and fruits for the majority of the population. Now, there are some of us who can do that. I can actually easily bulk on a 30 gram of fat day diet. Not everybody can do that. And so that's why you'll even see people like Dr. Mike with his Renaissance periodization telling people to eat all these whole fat dairy and stuff and add fattier cuts of meat when they're trying to bulk, because some people simply cannot consume enough calories. So that's what it comes down to there. But if you're able to consume the calories on a low fat diet like that, it's probably the best way for you to bulk, assuming that you can get the calories in. Meaning if you can get your calories in on that, you're going to have the lowest fat gains and you're going to have the best possible performance. So there's no problem there. Again, the concerns about insulin sensitivity that people have from carbs aren't caused by carbs. They're caused from prolonged caloric surplus to the point to where you start accruing unhealthy amounts of body fat. That's what the real concern there is. All right, next question. Jason, I've tried to ask this question a few times with no response. James Tiny Vest said for a good all-day protein source, drink a gallon of milk a day. A lot of sugar, if you ask me. I don't care if it's 2% whole or skim. That's a lot of sugar. What's your take/opinion? Thank you in advance. I'm not going to just take your word for it that he said this. I don't know much about James Tiny Vest. I know very, very little about the guy. I really have seen very little of his content. He may or may not have said that. So what I'm going to address is your concerns about the sugar in milk. People get this mixed up because where they make the mistake is that they have this automatic assumption that the word sugar means bad, that sugar is related to body fat gain, diabetes, and all that. And you need to understand the layman term sugar is not the nutritional science term sugar. Those are two separate things. Sugar in that context on the nutrition label only means it's a simple carbohydrate. The reality is milk sugars are not even that fast absorbing. In other words, they don't have this enormous glycemic load that you think of with most other sugars. Furthermore, the only sugar that has been linked to insulin resistance diabetes, fatty liver, all this stuff when consumed in excess is fructose. Now, table sugar, which most people think of as sugar, you know, that white granulated sugar, is 50% fructose by calorie. Now, consuming excessive amounts of that, particularly when bulking or gaining weight, that could cause problems. But lactose itself, unless you're lactose intolerant, isn't a particularly bad carb in regards to that. It's perfectly fine. I would be more concerned about people consuming whole milk and getting large amounts of saturated fat when using this to consume a caloric surplus. Now, if you're talking about a healthy if you're talking about a 17 or 18-year-old young man with really high testosterone levels who's training hard, who needs to gain 20 pounds for football or powerlifting or whatever it happens to be, he needs to get big. I don't think that's an unreasonable approach. I don't think that's an unreasonable approach at all, because it's not like he's going to get heart disease from spending 6 months bulking and eating some extra saturated fat. All right, that's not going to happen. Now, if you're 30 years old or 35 and you're drinking a gallon of whole milk a day with all that extra saturated fat, and you're pushing your body fat percentage up to 25% doing so, then that's cause for concern. That's a totally different thing. But if it's a short-term endeavor that someone needs to do who's healthy and young and very physically active, it's probably not even a big deal then. And that's assuming the whole milk route. But as far as the skim milk goes, I wouldn't be worried at all unless you're lactose intolerant, which has its own set of problems. All right, next question. Is it possible for an advanced lifter to make strength gains with 70% of their max? Yes, absolutely. However, what I'm going to say, it's not going to be the best strength gains in the world. If that is what you're doing as a primary strength gaining tool, once you're advanced already, that's probably not going to give you much strength outside of the hypertrophic response you get from it. Meaning a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle, and working at 70% is a good way to gain muscle mass and mass building blocks in your training. Or if you're going to use concurrent training and you want to do that, that's fine. Totally fine. But if your goal is maximum strength, that's not necessarily the best way to do so. You're going to need to either combine that with heavier blocks, where you are hitting numbers in the 85 up to 90% range, or you're going to need to do some concurrent style training to where you're hitting numbers up in that range at least once a week. So you really are going to need the combination of the two. In other words, an advanced lifter is going to flounder on their progressive overload if they try to exclusively train down around 70%, and they're going to struggle to accumulate both muscle mass and strength, because ultimately what you need to remember, hypertrophy is purely a product of training volume, right? Total training volume in the stimulate recovery adaptation cycle. Whereas in strength tends to be a combination of handling a heavy load, technique, and hypertrophy all combined together. That's where that combination gives it. And it's very, very hard to increase maximum strength with loads that low. Not saying they don't increase, because they do, just not as efficiently as you would with a heavier weight. All right, next question. I feel like my lower back cannot handle any more work for several days after my 10 sets of deadlift. What's your opinion on using a belt for accessory work like Romanian deadlift in those situations? Thanks, Jason. Keep up the great work. Well, here's a question I would ask you. If you're running like a 10x3 system, which he discussed further, that's what he's doing. You're doing 10x3 on deadlifts. I don't think you need any lower back work. So what's my thought about doing that as an accessory? You're doing a high volume deadlifting program. I think, and I'm just going to say this politely, the stupidest thing you could do would be to try to work in more lower back work. I think that's a nightmare. I think it's going to be a disaster. And so no, I wouldn't have you do any Romanian deadlifts at all. If you want more hamstring work, go find a glute ham raise. Get on a glute ham raise. Don't do anything else for your lower back, because you're probably also squatting. That's it. That's all you can take. You don't need anything else. All right, next question. If there is a significant gap between either of the main lifts, i.e. deadlift is at what would be considered an advanced level by charts, while squat and bench might be at levels considered early intermediate, should you make some changes to a cookie cutter intermediate in this case program in regard to this? Thanks. Keep up the good work. Yeah, that's normal. That's perfectly normal. You know what? I'm going to go out on a limb and say the majority of people, probably at least 60% of people at any given time, once they are to the intermediate stage or higher, are going to have lifts that are in different categories, right? You might be elite on one lift and still be late intermediate on another. There are cases that extreme. Didn't we see that recently with me? My deadlift would qualify as elite on the charts, but my pressing strength coming back, my benching strength when I first came back to benching for a little while was still probably, late intermediate. It happens. Guess what? You're going to need to program those lifts a little different. And that's perfectly normal. It's not uncommon to have half of your lifts in one category and half of your lifts in another. It really isn't that uncommon. That's actually the norm until you get to a very advanced or elite level, or you're an early novice. Expect to spend most of your training career with your lifts mixed, unless you are way at the extreme ends of the curve. And if you're not, then you're probably going to have multiple lifts in different categories in any given time. Right? That's normal. Program accordingly. Yes, you might need to program some of your training on certain lifts a little more aggressively than others. Some of them might need a little more priority than others if you want to bridge that gap. And you need to remember, some lifts you're just going to be so genetically predisposed to that they're going to tend to excel way above some of your other lifts. And I'm a perfect example. Yes, I have a massive rib cage. Yes, I have a big chest. Like to the point to where I can do floor presses and touch my chest just fine on floor presses right now. It's not a problem. But I tend to be a much, much stronger deadlifter than I am a bench presser, even in years where I'm doing 3 or 4 times as much training for my bench press as a deadlift. I'm just genetically better at that lift, and everyone has lifts that they are going to be naturally better at than others, and that's just the reality of it too. So program accordingly. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.